Hollywood was built on dreams, shining lights, red carpets, perfect smiles. But behind the flashbulbs, another world lurked. A world of smoke-filled rooms, whispered threats, and deals sealed with blood. The Mafia didn't just watch Hollywood from afar. It owned the stages, the casinos, even the lives of the stars. Some played along, some tried to fight, and some never lived to tell their story. This is the hidden history of 30 names, actors, singers, moguls, and gangsters, whose fame collided with the mob's ruthless power. Which of their stories will stay with you when the lights go out? 30. Dean Martin. Dean Martin was the very picture of smooth confidence. His velvet voice poured out of radios, his playful grin charmed television audiences, and his swagger on stage convinced the world he had everything under control. To fans, he wasn't just a singer or an actor, he was a symbol of ease, a man immune to worry, living the dream everyone else only imagined. But in truth, that dream rested on shadows. Martin's rise to fame was tied directly to Las Vegas, a city built as much by mob money as by neon lights. The Rat Pack Sinatra, Davis, Martin were adored by millions, but their shows were staged in casinos owned by men with blood on their hands. Every note he sang, every spotlight that shined on him, carried the quiet approval of mob bosses who ruled the desert empire. Frank Sinatra's well-known ties to Sam Giancana made headlines, but Martin too lived under the same unspoken arrangement. His safety, his stardom, his place as the king of cool, all came with a silent bargain. Never question the men in the shadows. Protection was guaranteed, but freedom was not. On stage he appeared effortless, carefree, untouchable. Off stage, he knew better than anyone that his life was being carefully managed, shaped, and allowed only within the boundaries set by organized crime. Dean Martin's story was not just about glamour and music. It was proof of how deeply the mob shaped Hollywood's golden years, and how even the coolest star of his generation could not escape the invisible chains of power that bound him. 29. Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel was the mobster who acted like a movie star. Handsome, magnetic, and dangerously charming, he fit right in among Hollywood's elite. He drank with actors, laughed with producers, and carried himself as if he belonged under the same spotlight as the stars he mingled with. But beneath that charisma was a ruthless killer, a man who rose from the violent streets of Brooklyn to become one of the most feared figures in organized crime. Siegel's greatest gamble was the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. To him, it was more than a casino, it was a palace of dreams, designed to lure the rich and famous into the desert. He wanted Hollywood to flock to his empire, to drink, dance, and gamble under his rule. For a while, the vision dazzled. Yet the costs soared, deadlines collapsed, and rumors began to spread that Siegel was pocketing mob money. For years, his charm had been his armor. Actors adored him, women fell under his spell, and even mob bosses hesitated to strike him down. But one June evening in 1947, that protection vanished. As Siegel sat in Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills home, calmly reading a newspaper, gunfire shattered the night. Bullets ripped through the window, striking him again and again. He died instantly, his once famous blue eyes left staring wide open, frozen in horror. The killing was clinical, merciless, and unforgettable. Hollywood gasped. If a man so adored, so connected, could be executed in such brutal fashion, what safety did anyone else have? Newspapers called it the first drive-by in Beverly Hills history. But to the stars who knew him, it was something darker, a message written in blood. Bugsy Siegel's death became more than a headline. It was a reminder that the mob's reach had no boundaries, that even glamour and power meant nothing when betrayal was suspected. In a city built on dreams, his violent end showed the nightmare lurking just beneath the shine. 28. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood was the face of innocence and beauty in Hollywood. From Rebel Without a Cause to West Side Story, she became the star audiences adored, her vulnerability on screen making millions believe they truly knew her. She was the girl next door, the tragic heroine, the perfect dream in a world built on fantasy. Yet behind the glowing smile and the silver screen, Natalie's life was far more fragile and far more dangerous. She moved in circles where power, politics, and organized crime often crossed paths. Her fame brought her close to influential men, and with them came whispers of debts, favors, and secrets better left unspoken. Friends recalled her fears, her unease, the sense that she was surrounded not only by admiration, but also by unseen forces that could turn on her at any moment. That fear became legend in the winter of 1981. Natalie set sail on her yacht, the Splendor, near Catalina Island, with her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken. She never returned alive. Hours later, her body was discovered drifting in the cold Pacific, her nightgown soaked, her life cut short. Officially, the cause was listed as accidental drowning. But the testimonies conflicted, the timelines twisted, and too many questions were left unanswered. Why had she been alone? Why did the stories change? And why did the silence afterward feel so heavy? To the world, it was a tragedy that robbed Hollywood of one of its brightest lights. To insiders, it was a chilling reminder of how fragile a star could be once the shadows closed in. Some believed it was jealousy, others a fight gone wrong. Still others whispered of ties to powerful men who wanted her voice silenced forever. Natalie Wood's death remains one of Hollywood's most haunting mysteries. Her films live on, but her final night is shrouded in darkness, proof that even the most beloved face on the silver screen could vanish under circumstances that still echo with suspicion. 27. Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana was not just another mob boss, he was a man who tied the criminal underworld to the highest levels of Hollywood and politics. Charismatic and ruthless, he rose from the bloody streets of Chicago to lead the feared outfit. But unlike his predecessors, he craved glamour as much as power. He adored the company of stars, was often seen with Frank Sinatra, and was rumored to have had affairs with Marilyn Monroe. In whispers, Giancana's name was mentioned alongside presidents and movie icons, a dangerous blend of crime and celebrity that fascinated the public. But living in both worlds made him a threat. By the mid-1970s, federal investigators closed in, preparing to summon him before grand juries. Word spread that Giancana might finally talk, revealing decades of secrets from mob-backed casino empires to Hollywood's hidden ties, even hints of political scandals. For a man who had built his career on loyalty, the suspicion of betrayal was a death sentence. In June of 1975, the end came quietly but brutally. Giancana was found in his basement kitchen, cooking a midnight snack, when bullets tore into him. 7 shots, precise and cold, ended his life in an instant. No forced entry, no robbery, just execution. Hollywood watched in morbid fascination. Here was a man who had dined with stars and presidents, erased in silence as if his fame meant nothing. His death sent a message that rang across the country. No matter how high you climbed, no matter who you knew, the mob's law was final. Giancana's murder remains unsolved. But for Hollywood, it was proof that the very men who stood at premieres and mingled with legends could also vanish in a pool of blood, their secrets buried forever. 26. Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate embodied Hollywood's golden promise. With her luminous beauty and growing talent, she seemed destined for superstardom. Married to director Roman Polanski, she lived in the center of Los Angeles's most glamorous circles, a life of glittering parties, famous friends, and endless possibilities. Yet fame in Hollywood was never just glitz. It carried shadows, and Sharon's world was full of them. In the late 1960s, whispers of drugs, jealousy, and darker forces swirled around the elite. Some said Hollywood had become a playground for crime and chaos, a stage where the mob and other predators quietly circled the stars. Sharon, radiant and pregnant, seemed untouched by it all until the summer of 1969. On the night of August 9th, terror struck. Followers of Charles Manson stormed Sharon's Los Angeles home. In a frenzy of unimaginable violence, she and her friends were murdered, leaving the world horrified. The crime was blamed on the Manson cult, but theories spread quickly. Some claimed it was more than madness, that it was a message tied to Hollywood's hidden underworld, perhaps even a mob-style warning cloaked in chaos. Her death sent shockwaves through the film industry. Hollywood, once thought of as untouchable, suddenly felt vulnerable. The murder of a rising star, young, beautiful, and innocent, destroyed the illusion that fame could shield anyone. Sharon Tate's tragedy remains one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood's history. Her name has become a symbol of innocence lost, and her final night is still debated decades later, proof that in the city of stars, terror could strike without mercy. 25. Paul Castellano. Paul Castellano was called Big Paul, the boss who ran the Gambino crime family as though it were a Fortune 500 company. He wore custom suits, dined in Manhattan's finest restaurants, and carried himself like a businessman rather than a street thug. To politicians and even some Hollywood figures, he seemed almost respectable. But behind that polished exterior, Castellano ruled through fear, money, and blood. He demanded loyalty, but his appetite for luxury and his iron grip on the family sparked resentment within his own ranks. By the mid-1980s, rivals plotted his downfall. Castellano, comfortable in his routines, never imagined his end would come in the open, under the eyes of the public. On a December night in 1985, he stepped from a car in front of Sparks Steakhouse in New York. Before he could adjust his coat, gunmen appeared. The street erupted with gunfire. Bullets tore into his body, leaving him dead on the cold pavement as horrified witnesses screamed. The execution stunned America. This was not a back alley killing, it was a mob boss cut down in the middle of Manhattan, in front of holiday crowds. For Hollywood, it was as if a gangster movie had spilled into real life. The assassination of Paul Castellano proved that in the Mafia world, no amount of power or refinement could buy safety. 24. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was the voice of an era smooth, magnetic, adored on stage and on screen, to the world. He was the ultimate entertainer, the man whose songs defined romance and whose charm never faded. Yet Sinatra's career was shadowed by whispers that refused to die, whispers of late-night meetings, favors exchanged, and friendships with some of the most feared mob bosses in America. His bond with Sam Giancana was no secret. Sinatra sang in mob-controlled casinos, accepted their protection, and enjoyed their influence when doors in Hollywood or Las Vegas needed opening. To his fans, he was Old Blue Eyes. To the mob, he was both an asset and a liability. The FBI filled files with notes about him, tracking every rumor, every possible connection. Though Sinatra lived a long life and died of natural causes, the rumors never left. They followed him through decades of fame, reminding the world that the crooner's career had always been tangled with men who lived by the gun. For Hollywood, Sinatra's story was a warning disguised as glamour. Even the brightest star could be pulled into the shadows, and sometimes, survival depended on keeping the right friends in the wrong places. 23. Carmine Galante. Carmine Galante was feared by his enemies and even by his own allies. Known as the Cigar, he strutted through New York as if he were invincible, puffing on his trademark cigar with a grin that dared anyone to challenge him. He built his fortune on heroin, flooding American streets with drugs while enjoying the life of a king. Unlike other mob bosses who hid in the shadows, Galante flaunted his power in public, as if no one could touch him. But arrogance in the mob world was fatal. By the late 1970s, his refusal to share profits with other crime families turned friends into bitter enemies. Everyone knew Galante's time was running out, but he refused to change his ways. On a hot July afternoon in Brooklyn, Galante sat in the garden of a small Italian restaurant, surrounded by companions, savoring his lunch. Suddenly, masked gunmen burst in. Within seconds, bullets ripped through him. He collapsed, cigar still clenched between his teeth, a chilling image frozen forever in photographs that would shock the nation. Hollywood directors later borrowed that image, using it to inspire gangster films, But for those who knew him, Galante's bloody end was no fiction. It was the price of greed and arrogance in a world where loyalty was just another word for survival. 22. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was Hollywood's brightest flame, the blonde goddess whose beauty and vulnerability captivated the world. On screen, she was dazzling, playful, irresistible. Off-screen, she lived a life tangled in secrets, power, and whispers of danger. Her relationships with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert made headlines, but behind those headlines were darker rumors that she was also connected to mob boss Sam Giancana. Marilyn was caught between worlds. To the public, she was a fantasy. To powerful men, she was a risk. Friends said she knew too much about affairs, about deals, about conversations never meant for daylight. And knowledge, in her world, was dangerous. In the summer of 1962, she was found dead in her Los Angeles home, officially declared an overdose. But the story never satisfied. Why were phone records erased? Why did her friends claim she had been planning a new life? And why did the silence around her death feel so deliberate? Her passing shocked the world, leaving millions heartbroken. Yet in Hollywood, many believed the tragedy was more than drugs and despair. Marilyn Monroe's end became a symbol of how fame, beauty, and secrets could collide with forces powerful enough to erase even the most iconic woman alive. 21. Johnny Stompanato. Johnny Stompanato had the looks of a leading man but the life of a gangster. Tall, well-dressed, and dangerously charming, he moved through Hollywood's elite circles under the wing of Los Angeles mob boss Mickey Cohen. To socialites and actresses, he was magnetic. To insiders, he was a reminder that crime and glamour often shared the same bed. His most infamous romance was with screen legend Lana Turner. To the public, they were dazzling, a picture-perfect couple, walking red carpets and gracing headlines. Behind closed doors, their love story was poisoned. Stompanato was jealous, controlling, and often violent. Lana endured threats and humiliation, trapped in a cycle that she feared would destroy her. The nightmare climaxed one April night in 1958. As a heated argument spiraled out of control, Lana's teenage daughter, Cheryl Crane, rushed into the room, terrified for her mother's safety. In a desperate moment, she stabbed Stompanato with a kitchen knife. He staggered, collapsed, and died within minutes. The scandal erupted like wildfire. Newspapers screamed with lurid headlines. The trial became a media storm, and rumors spread that the mob had quietly approved his death. For Lana, the tragedy haunted her forever. For Hollywood, it was proof that even its brightest stars could be dragged into the darkness of organized crime, leaving blood on the carpets where glamour once reigned. 20. Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was more than a union leader, he was a kingmaker. As the head of the Teamsters, he controlled the largest labor union in America, a position that gave him extraordinary power over money, politics, and even entertainment. Hoffa dined with stars, courted politicians, and struck deals with mob bosses who relied on his influence. To his supporters, he was a champion of workers. To his enemies, he was a man who knew far too many secrets. After serving prison time, Hoffa fought to reclaim his throne, but in trying to return, he threatened men who no longer trusted him. He carried inside knowledge of mob operations, hidden payoffs, and unspoken connections between Hollywood and organized crime. That knowledge made him dangerous. On a July afternoon in 1975, Hoffa drove to a suburban Detroit restaurant for a meeting. He never came back. His car was found, but Hoffa had vanished without a trace. No note, no body, no final words. The disappearance launched one of the largest investigations in American history. Fields were dug, rivers searched, theories spun, yet no one ever solved the mystery. For Hollywood and the public alike, Hoffa became a ghost story, a reminder that when the mob wanted silence, it could erase not only a life, but a legacy, leaving only questions behind. Ninetdagen, Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was not a man of violence but of numbers. Known as the mob's accountant, He built the financial empire that allowed organized crime to thrive across America. He never sought the spotlight, preferring to let others make headlines while he quietly counted the profits. Yet his reach was immense, stretching from Havana casinos to Las Vegas showrooms, where Hollywood's biggest names performed under mob-owned lights. Actors and singers often never realized that their contracts, their paychecks, even the stages they graced were financed and controlled by Lansky's calculations. He understood money better than anyone else, and he knew that power did not always come from guns. Sometimes it came from ledgers and bank accounts. The government chased him for decades, but Lansky was always one step ahead. He hid millions, evaded convictions, and lived comfortably while others fell to bullets or prison cells. To frustrated prosecutors, he was the mobster who slipped through their fingers. By the time of his death in Miami in 1983, Lansky was both feared and strangely admired. For Hollywood, he represented a different kind of danger. The quiet man behind the curtain who ensured the mob's grip on the entertainment industry never loosened. He proved that sometimes the deadliest figures were not the ones firing shots, but the ones keeping the books. 18. Sal Mineo. Sal Mineo was one of Hollywood's brightest young stars, remembered for his haunting role in Rebel Without a Cause, alongside James Dean. With his intense eyes and raw vulnerability, he captured the hearts of audiences and earned acclaim that promised a long, glittering career. But fame in Hollywood was never just about talent. Behind the curtain, Mineo lived a life that drew him closer to danger than anyone realized. In West Hollywood, he mingled in circles that overlapped with the underworld nightclubs, music venues, and figures who demanded loyalty. He was outspoken, fiercely independent, and unwilling to bend to intimidation. That defiance, some said, earned him powerful enemies. On a February night in 1976, Sal returned home after rehearsal. In the alley outside his apartment, shadows closed in. A knife struck deep into his chest. He collapsed, bleeding to death before help could arrive. Police called it a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was stolen, not his wallet, not his jewelry, not even his car. Whispers spread instantly. Friends claimed he had received threats that someone wanted him silenced. To this day, many refuse to believe it was random violence. For Hollywood, the murder of Sal Mineo was a chilling reminder. Even the most talented, even the most beloved, could be erased in an instant if they crossed the wrong people. 17. Al Capone. Al Capone was the face of American organized crime. A name so powerful it became shorthand for the gangster himself. He ruled Chicago during Prohibition, flooding the city with bootleg liquor and ruling with violence that shocked the nation. Yet Capone was not just a criminal, he was a celebrity. Newspapers covered his every move, and Hollywood could not resist turning his legend into a character on the silver screen. Actors, singers, and producers were drawn to him, fascinated by his mix of charm and menace. Capone hosted lavish parties, entertained the rich and famous, and carried himself as though he were untouchable. But beneath the tailored suits and the famous smile was a man responsible for blood on the streets. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 7 men were gunned down in broad daylight, made him infamous around the world. Eventually, it was not bullets that brought him down, but numbers. Convicted of tax evasion in the 1930s, Capone was sent to prison, his health destroyed by disease until he died years later in near obscurity. Yet his legend never faded. For Hollywood, Al Capone became more than a man. He was a myth, an icon, a story too large to die. Every gangster film that followed carried echoes of his life, proving that sometimes the darkest criminals also cast the longest shadows. 16. Virginia Hill. Virginia Hill was no ordinary mob associate. She was the glamorous redhead who moved with ease between Hollywood royalty and underworld bosses. To the stars, she was a glittering socialite, dining with Clark Gable and Frank Sinatra. To the mob, she was far more valuable. A courier, a money manager, and a woman who knew how to keep secrets. Her most famous connection was with Bugsy Siegel. Their romance was fiery and dangerous, a love story played out under the eyes of both the mob and Hollywood's gossip columns. When Siegel was gunned down in her Beverly Hills home in 1947, suspicion immediately fell on her. Was she complicit in his death? Or was she simply another pawn sacrificed in the mob's endless power games? After Siegel's murder, Virginia's once glittering life turned darker. She fled America, drifting across Europe with wealth but no safety. By the mid-1960s, she was broke, isolated, and still carrying secrets. In 1966, her body was discovered in Austria, the official report claiming an overdose. Few believed it. For Hollywood, Virginia Hill's story was a reminder that glamour could be a mask for terror. She had lived in both worlds, adored by actors, trusted by killers, but in the end, the shadows claimed her. Her beauty made her famous, but her knowledge made her expendable. 15. Anthony Spilotro. Anthony Spilotro, known as Tony the Ant, was the mob's enforcer in Las Vegas, a man whose brutality earned him both fear and fascination. He wasn't content to stay in the shadows. Spilotro enjoyed the attention, dropping his name in Hollywood circles and even advising filmmakers who wanted their gangster movies to feel authentic. To some stars, being seen with him added an edge of danger, like wearing a badge of power. But that hunger for recognition became his downfall. By the mid-1980s, Spilotro's violent reputation and constant headlines made him too visible. What had once been an asset became a liability. The bosses who once relied on him now saw him as reckless, a threat to their survival. In June of 1986, Spilotro and his brother were summoned to a supposed meeting. They never returned. Days later, their bodies were found buried in an Indiana cornfield, beaten savagely and buried alive. It was one of the most notorious mob executions in history, later immortalized in Martin Scorsese's Casino. For Hollywood, Spilotro's gruesome end was more than a crime story. It was the closing act of a man who blurred the line between the silver screen and the streets. His life proved that when the mob grew tired of its stars, even the most feared enforcer could be silenced in the dirt. 14. Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll, the cultural giant who changed music forever. On stage, he shook the world with his voice and his moves, while off-stage he lived like royalty, adored by millions. Yet even a legend like Elvis could not escape the shadows of organized crime. Las Vegas became his kingdom in the 1970s, but the casinos where he performed were controlled by the mob. His contracts, his earnings, even the stages he owned with his presence were tied to men who dealt in blood and money. Some claimed the mob protected him, while others whispered of debts and favors that trapped him in arrangements he could not refuse. As his health declined and his dependence on drugs grew, Elvis became paranoid, speaking of powerful people watching him. When he died at Graceland in 1977, the official cause was heart failure. But almost immediately, rumors spread. Was it only drugs? Or had the mob silenced a man who knew too much about the empire behind the neon lights? The truth may never be known. What remains is the image of Elvis, a man who conquered music and film, yet may have lived his final years under the same invisible chains that held so many stars before him. His death was a reminder that even kings are not safe when the mob controls the throne. 13. Jack Legs Diamond. Jack Legs Diamond was called the clay pigeon of the underworld because no matter how many times gunmen tried to kill him, he somehow survived. Handsome, stylish, and reckless, he lived like a character straight out of a Hollywood script. He partied with showgirls, flashed his wealth in Broadway clubs, and carried himself as if fate itself had chosen him to be untouchable. But arrogance in the mob world is a death sentence. Diamond's constant defiance of rivals and his taste for fame made him enemies on every corner. He relished the attention, inviting headlines and whispers, but each time he escaped an assassination attempt, the hunger to see him fall only grew stronger. In December of 1931, just hours after being acquitted in court, Diamond returned to his hideout in Albany. That night, the illusion of invincibility ended. Gunmen burst in and riddled him with bullets as he lay in bed. The man who had dodged death so many times finally met the ending everyone had predicted. Hollywood writers and filmmakers would later use his story as a template for the rise and fall gangster myth. The daring outlaw who shines too brightly, defies too many enemies, and ultimately pays in blood. For the stars who once partied with him, Diamond's Fall was a sobering lesson. Survival in that world was never about luck. 12. Robert Evans. Robert Evans was one of the most powerful producers Hollywood had ever seen. He turned novels into classics, shepherding films like Chinatown and The Godfather, stories that defined an era and cemented his reputation as a creative kingpin. With his striking looks and impeccable style, Evans lived like a star in his own right, throwing legendary parties that drew actors, directors, and power brokers to his Beverly Hills mansion. But his glittering life was never far from shadows. Evans moved in circles that brushed dangerously close to organized crime. His name surfaced in investigations linking Hollywood moguls to mob-controlled drug rings and money laundering operations. Some claim that the same underworld forces that inspired The Godfather were sitting at Evans's dinner table. As the years passed, scandal clung to him. He battled accusations, personal struggles, and the steady decline of his career. Yet even as his star dimmed, he remained a living symbol of Hollywood's double life, a world where glamour and corruption were bound together so tightly that one could not exist without the other. Robert Evans left behind films that remain immortal. But his story is also a reminder that Hollywood did not just borrow from mob legends sometimes, it was built on them. 11. Dino Bravo. Dino Bravo was a powerhouse in the wrestling ring, a Canadian strongman who thrilled crowds with his brute force and flamboyant persona. To fans, he was a hero, larger than life, strutting beneath the arena lights with confidence that seemed unshakable. For years he lived off the adoration, but when his wrestling career began to fade, the glitter of fame could no longer sustain his lavish lifestyle. In search of money, Bravo stepped into a different kind of arena, the underworld of cigarette smuggling in Montreal. The trade was profitable, but it was tightly controlled by the mob. For a time, Bravo prospered, living comfortably as if the game would never end. But rumors soon spread that he had betrayed his partners, skimming profits, or learning too much about the operation. In the Mafia's world, that kind of mistake carried only one outcome. On a March evening in 1993, Bravo's wife and daughter returned home to horror. He sat slumped in a chair, riddled with 17 bullets. Nothing was stolen, no signs of a struggle, just the unmistakable signature of a mob execution. For wrestling fans, the news was shattering. Their idol, once cheered by thousands, had been cut down far from the ring he once ruled. For Hollywood and the entertainment world, his death proved again that the mob's reach extended everywhere, even into the spectacle of professional wrestling, where scripted drama could never match the finality of real blood. 10. Charles Lucky Luciano. Charles Lucky Luciano was not simply another mobster, he was the architect of modern organized crime. Calculating, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, he reshaped the Mafia into a national powerhouse by creating the Commission, a governing council that kept the mob's sprawling empires under control. His influence stretched from the streets of New York to the neon glow of Las Vegas, and even into Hollywood itself. Luciano moved with ease among the famous and the powerful. He enjoyed the company of actors, singers, and producers who saw him as both dangerous and magnetic. To them, he was a thrilling companion, a living embodiment of the gangster characters audiences loved on screen. But behind the charm, he was the man deciding who lived, who died, and who prospered in a world run by crime. After years of imprisonment in the United States, Luciano was deported to Italy. Yet even exile could not dim his power. In Naples, he lived lavishly, entertaining mob associates and visiting celebrities alike. But in January of 1962, while meeting contacts at Naples airport, he collapsed suddenly and died. The official cause was a heart attack, but whispers of poison persisted, fueled by the belief that he knew too much to be allowed to talk. For Hollywood, Luciano's life and death became myth. He was the model for countless gangster films, cold, brilliant, unstoppable. His legacy proved that the mob was not just an influence on cinema, it was a blueprint for the stories Hollywood told and the power structures it quietly obeyed. 9. James Caan. James Caan was the actor who made the mob feel real. His explosive performance as Sonny Corleone in The Godfather was so convincing that audiences believed he must have lived the life he portrayed. With his fierce energy and violent outbursts on screen, Caan became the face of cinematic gangster fury, a role that followed him for the rest of his career. But Caan's off-screen world blurred dangerously close to the one he depicted. He grew up in New York, surrounded by neighborhoods where organized crime was woven into daily life. Stories circulated about his friendships with men tied to the mob, relationships he never fully denied. Some insiders claimed he sought authenticity by immersing himself in those circles, learning their language, their posture, even their humor. Though never charged with any crime, the rumors clung to him. In Hollywood, where image was everything, the whispers only added to his legend. To fans, he wasn't just playing Sonny Corleone, he was Sonny, a man with one foot in the spotlight and the other in the shadows. James Caan's career flourished, but his legacy remained tied to the idea that his performances were more than acting. They were lived experiences, drawn from a world where mobsters and movie stars often brushed shoulders. For Hollywood, he was the living proof that sometimes the line between art and reality is far thinner than anyone dares to admit. 8. Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz was one of the most feared figures of the Prohibition era. With a quick temper and ruthless methods, he built an empire on bootlegging, extortion, and gambling. He wasn't just another street thug, he was a man who dreamed of controlling everything, even reaching into the world of nightclubs where Hollywood stars performed and mob money flowed freely. But Schultz's ambition made him reckless. He attracted the attention of law enforcement and the fury of his fellow mob bosses. When he openly threatened to assassinate a federal prosecutor, his allies decided he had crossed a line too dangerous to ignore. In October of 1935, Schultz sat at a table in a Newark restaurant when assassins burst in. Bullets tore through his body, leaving him slumped on the floor in a pool of blood. Remarkably, he survived long enough to mutter incoherent ramblings on his deathbed, a stream of strange, last words that baffled police and became legend. For Hollywood, Schultz was irresistible inspiration. His story of arrogance, violence, and inevitable downfall became the skeleton of countless gangster films. To the entertainment world, his death was not just another mob hit, it was a reminder that men who rise too quickly and burn too brightly are destined to fall in flames. 7. Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford was the polished English gentleman who seemed to have everything Hollywood stardom, Rat Pack fame, and even a marriage into the Kennedy family. On the surface, he embodied sophistication, the actor who moved effortlessly between red carpets and political gatherings. Yet his place at the intersection of Hollywood, politics, and crime made his life far darker than it appeared. As a member of the Rat Pack, Lawford stood shoulder to shoulder with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, performing in casinos that were firmly under mob control. Behind the laughter and the drinks, deals were whispered in smoke-filled back rooms. Lawford's access to both stars and statesmen made him valuable, but it also made him vulnerable. His connection to the Kennedy family only deepened the intrigue. Rumors swirled that he acted as a bridge between powerful politicians, Hollywood icons, and mob bosses. As his career declined, those associations haunted him. Roles dried up, friendships crumbled, and Lawford drifted into scandal and isolation. By the time of his death in 1984, he was a shadow of the star he once had been. For Hollywood, his life was a stark reminder that glamour was often a mask. Peter Lawford's fall showed how quickly privilege could become poison when fame, politics, and the mob collided. 6. Albert Anastasia. Albert Anastasia was one of the most terrifying mob figures of the 20th century. Known as the Lord High Executioner, he ruled Murder Incorporated, the Mafia's enforcement arm that carried out countless hits across America. His name alone sent shivers through neighborhoods, yet Anastasia lived with the taste of a celebrity. He wore tailored suits, stayed in luxury hotels, and appeared in the same nightclubs where Hollywood stars drank and danced. Unlike other mob bosses who preferred shadows, Anastasia craved attention. He was unpredictable, violent, and hungry for power. His ruthlessness even unsettled his allies, who began to view him as a dangerous liability. By the late 1950s, the decision was made. Anastasia had to go. On an October morning in 1957, Anastasia entered the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for a simple shave. Reclining in the barber's chair, he never saw the killer's approach. Gunmen stormed the shop and opened fire. Struggling to rise, he turned toward the mirror, his reflection shattered by bullets, before collapsing lifeless to the floor. The brazen murder shocked the nation. Photographs of the blood-stained barbershop spread across newspapers and later became iconic, inspiring countless scenes in gangster films. For Hollywood, Anastasia's death was more than news. It was cinema made real, proof that even the most feared mob king could be executed in broad daylight. 5. Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen was Los Angeles's most flamboyant gangster, a man who blurred the line between mobster and celebrity. Always dressed in sharp suits and dripping in gold jewelry, he cruised through the city in flashy cars and courted the press as if he were a movie star himself. Cohen loved the spotlight, and Hollywood could not look away. He attended premieres, posed for photographs, and rubbed shoulders with actors who both feared and admired him. But behind the charm was ruthless ambition. Cohen ran gambling rackets, extortion schemes, and protection operations that touched nearly every corner of Los Angeles nightlife. Producers, nightclub owners, and even entertainers knew his name carried weight and a threat. Pay what he demanded or face the consequences. The attention he drew eventually became his undoing. Federal authorities circled, rivals schemed, and his once sprawling empire crumbled. Officially, Cohen died of stomach cancer in 1976, but the rumors never faded. Some believed he had been poisoned in prison to ensure he would never reveal what he knew about Hollywood's hidden ties to the mob. For the film industry, Cohen was more than a gangster. He was a character who seemed made for the screen, a man who performed his criminal life as if it were theater. His story remains a chilling reminder that Hollywood did not just write mob tales, it lived them. 4. Robert Blake. Robert Blake was a child star who grew into a respected actor, remembered for his haunting performance in Cold Blood and for his gritty television work. But his legacy would forever be overshadowed by a scandal that blurred the line between Hollywood tragedy and true crime nightmare. In 2001, Blake's wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley, was found shot dead in a car outside a Los Angeles restaurant. The couple's relationship had been turbulent, full of accusations and betrayal, and Blake quickly became the prime suspect. The story exploded across headlines, transforming him from celebrated actor to the center of one of Hollywood's darkest modern scandals. Blake insisted on his innocence, but prosecutors painted him as a man driven to murder. The trial became a media circus, exposing sordid details of his personal life. In the end, he was acquitted of the criminal charges, but later found liable in a civil case, leaving his reputation destroyed and his career in ruins. Though his downfall was not the work of the Mafia, Blake's story carried the same elements that had haunted Hollywood for decades: fame, betrayal, and a violent end that played out like a script too grim for the screen. For the public, it was a chilling reminder that even beloved stars could find themselves trapped in the darkest shadows of Hollywood's stage. 3. Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese was one of the most feared mafia bosses of the 20th century, a man whose quiet cunning made him as dangerous as any gunman. He preferred control over chaos, moving pieces behind the scenes rather than chasing headlines. His influence seeped into labor unions, casinos, and even Hollywood studios, where contracts and productions were often tied to mob-controlled hands. Genovese demanded absolute obedience. Allies who crossed him vanished, and rivals were erased without mercy. His ambition knew no limits, and he dreamed of ruling the American underworld with an iron grip. But ambition in the Mafia always drew enemies, and soon the government closed in. In the late 1950s, he was convicted on narcotics charges and sent to prison. Even behind bars, Genovese tried to run his empire, issuing orders through loyal messengers. But power in a cage is fragile, and whispers spread that his own associates had grown tired of his reign. In 1969, Genovese died in federal custody, officially from a heart attack. Few believed the report. To many, it was clear that the mob itself had arranged his quiet removal, ensuring he would never again threaten their control. For Hollywood, his story was a reminder that the true rulers of its golden years were not the studio heads or the stars, but men like Genovese, invisible puppeteers who decided fates from the shadows and who left only blood and fear in their wake. 2. Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci was never a mobster, but to millions of moviegoers, he might as well have been. His performances in Goodfellas, Casino, and Raging Bull were so sharp, so authentic, that audiences believed he had lived the life he portrayed. With his quick temper, cutting voice, and sudden bursts of violence, Pesci became the very embodiment of the cinematic gangster. Part of what made him so convincing was his past. Growing up in New Jersey, Pesci lived close to the neighborhoods where the mob ruled the streets. Friends and insiders whispered that he drew inspiration directly from real gangsters he had known, their slang, their swagger, their menace. On screen, it felt less like acting and more like a man channeling the danger he had absorbed firsthand. Though Pesci never faced the violence of his characters, the association followed him. Fans and critics alike blurred the line between art and reality, treating him as if he were forever bound to the mob world he depicted. In a way, that was his gift and his curse. For Hollywood, Joe Pesci symbolized the fascination and fear that surrounded organized crime. He reminded the world that gangsters did not just inspire cinema, sometimes cinema made them immortal. 1. Joe Colombo. Joe Colombo was unlike any other mob boss. While most preferred the shadows, he stepped boldly into the spotlight. He founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, held rallies in New York, and styled himself as a defender of his people. Cameras captured him shaking hands, giving speeches, and speaking against the way Italians were portrayed in films. Even Hollywood felt his influence when producers of The Godfather altered their script to satisfy his protests. But Colombo's taste for attention was dangerous. Other mob leaders despised the glare he invited onto their world. Law enforcement circled closer, and rivals whispered that his public crusade had gone too far. Still, Colombo stood proudly at rallies, convinced that his blend of mob power and political theater made him untouchable. On a summer day in 1971, he addressed a massive crowd in Columbus Circle. Thousands cheered as he spoke. Then, a gunman pushed forward and fired 3 bullets into him at point-blank range. The shooter was killed instantly, but Colombo survived only to spend years in a coma before dying in 1978. The attack was shocking, not just for its violence but for its setting. It happened in broad daylight, in front of cameras and witnesses, a mob hit disguised as public spectacle. For Hollywood, Colombo's fall was a brutal reminder. In organized crime, fame was never power. Fame was a death sentence. From Dean Martin's velvet voice echoing in mob-owned casinos to Joe Colombo collapsing in front of thousands, these stories reveal one unsettling truth. Hollywood's glitter was never separate from the mob's grip. Fame could draw crowds, but it could not stop bullets. Success could build legends, but it could not erase debts. Some stars like Marilyn Monroe and Natalie Wood left behind mysteries that still haunt us. Others like Bugsy Siegel and Paul Castellano were executed in scenes more violent than any film, and a few, like Jimmy Hoffa, simply vanished, leaving only questions and silence. Together, these 30 tales remind us that behind every spotlight there was a shadow, and behind every dream was a threat. Hollywood dazzled the world, but the mob decided who lived, who fell, and who disappeared. Which story will stay with you when the lights fade?